All right, hey audio students, hope you're doing good. This is a presentation on sound phenomena. A little bit different than what we were going through before. A lot of the stuff that we're talking about before was a lot of the tools and just the fundamentals of sound and sound design. This is a little bit different. This is really talking a lot about, some of it is talking about psychoacoustic principles and basically how we hear sound in our minds. And other stuff is really describing the physical properties of how sound works in a little bit more detail. And hopefully some of this stuff can help you out with your music production projects or your sound design projects. So here are some of the stuff that we're going to be talking about. So Fletcher-Munson curve is a really important thing. It kind of describes how we hear as human beings. Something called the inverse square law, which is also used in worlds outside of sound as well. So like for NASA uses something called the inverse square law. We can talk about that later. And then we'll talk about the other stuff on the left side, which is phase, masking, and something called the Haas effect, which is a pretty cool thing. So let's go ahead and take it away. So let's start with the Fletcher-Munson curve. This is something that we should all know about because it really kind of encompasses how we hear as human beings based on our biology and how our ears work and how small our ear canals are and all that kind of stuff. So we could take a look at this. So first and foremost, the Fletcher-Munson curve talks about how we hear different frequencies at different volumes. So you think about this is, if you're in a car or if you got headphones on or if you're listening to speakers, if you're listening to music at a very low volume, you're not really hearing a lot of the bright high frequencies, but neither are you hearing any of the bass frequencies as well, right? So if you're driving down the highway and you got your music down at a very low volume, you're not going to really feel the bass. And you're not going to really hear the crispy, clear high end as well until you actually start turning up the music. And so once you start turning up the music, then you can start to feel all that bass and then you can hear all that clarity and all that kind of stuff. This has to do with the way our ears are basically made, right? The biology of our ears. So that's one of the reasons. And we're going to look at the curve in a little bit. But that's kind of what the Fletcher-Munson curve describes. When they talk about the curve, it's actually they mapped out how we hear at different volumes. And you're looking at all these different curves. I'm going to make this a little bit bigger later, but that's kind of what that is. And so here's the thing about our ears, and here's the thing about being human beings. We hear mid-range very well. So one of the things that we're exceptional at is hearing mid-range. And when you think about this, one of the most predominant sources out there that is in the mid-range frequencies is vocals. Our vocals, if you remember, the fundamental frequency of a vocal is anywhere between 4, maybe 5, maybe 6,000 hertz, maybe 7,000 hertz. But those are the upper mid-range frequencies. But we hear low frequencies very poorly, and we also hear the very high frequencies very poorly as well. So that's something to keep in mind. And, as you are listening in the world, in this very, big world, you want to think about how you're listening and what kind of frequencies are you listening? What frequencies are you listening at different volumes? Those are some of the things. So let's take a look at this curve. So I'm going to open this up. And here is what the curve looks like. All right, so this curve has been updated over the years, but this is generally what the curve is. And if you look at the bottom, the curve is pretty drastic, but as you get higher, the curve gets a little bit more flat, although it's never completely flat. So what you're seeing here is your intensity or your volume. So this is 0 dB SPL, and this is 120 dB SPL. This is a threshold of a pain. The average level of conversation is around 60 dB SPL. So this is your volume right here. And then you got your frequency. So anywhere from 20 to 20K, although 10K is over here, maybe 20K is over here, I'm not sure. So they have your frequencies all mapped out right here. So if you go to, for example, the 20 dB SPL line, 20 dB SPL is really not a lot. That's like you going inside of a conference room with nothing there and you're already hearing about 20 dB SPL. If you go inside of a theater and there's no sound, you're already at 20 dB SPL because some of the machine makes noises. Maybe there's a fan up there that's making noises. There's these, very small extraneous noises. So, and then when you get to 40 dB SPL, that's probably like, the sound of a quiet vacuum cleaner or something like that. 60 dB SPL is the sound of a vocal, of a conversation, right? Then you get higher and higher. So let's say, for example, you're in a place where something's giving you 20 dB SPL volume. Well, at that case, you're not going to be able to hear 20 hertz. You're not going to be able to hear anything at 100 hertz. But as soon as you cross this line right here, so it looks like you can hear at 20 dB SPL maybe about 160 hertz or something like that. I'm guessing this is 200, so maybe like around 200 hertz or something. So you can hear that, right? What else can you hear at 20 dB SPL? You can hear some of the mid-range right here, right? So at 20 dB SPL, you can hear some of the mid-range. So anywhere between was 100, 200, 300, 400, 500. So 500 hertz to about 1,000 hertz. Then it dips in the upper mids, and then it goes back up here. That's probably like around 8K or something like that. I'm not sure. So obviously, what it's saying at 20 dB SPL, which is a very low volume, you're not hearing any of the low frequencies, but you're hearing some of the mid frequencies and a little bit of the high frequencies up here. Now, the louder you go, let's say, for example, 80 dB SPL, you can hear more of the lower mids, right? And let's say you're at 100 dB SPL, you can hear all those lows and all those mids. There's a little dip in the upper mids, but then it comes back up here, and you can hear some of those high frequencies over here. So the louder you go, the flatter, the more frequencies you can hear, the more lows, the mids, and the highs. The lower it is, the less low frequencies and the less high frequencies you can hear, but you can really hear the mid-range very well. And that's just part of being a human being. So that's kind of what the curve is describing, right? That's really like the general idea of the curve. Now, what information does this give you? Like, how can you apply this curve into your real life? Well, when you're right? When you're mixing, you can mix at certain levels so you can hear all those frequencies that you're mixing, right? If you have volume, like in your studio at and your playback is at a low volume, and you start mixing bass frequencies, like a bass guitar or like a thunder from a sound design project, you're not going to be really mixing that instrument or that sound effect accurately, because you're not going to be able to hear all those frequencies. So that's the problem, right? So when you're mixing, or when you're listening to music, or when you're doing a sound design project, you want to be at optimal levels so you can mix at a very accurate way. So that's the whole point of the Fletcher-Munson curve. So what is an optimal listening level? It's around 85 dB SPL, maybe 80, maybe 90, but it's going to be in the realm of around 85 dB SPL. Because if you look at the curve here, pull it back up, the curve is telling you that around 85 dB SPL is kind of flat. Although it's not extremely flat, it's kind of flat. 90 dB SPL is fairly flat as well, right? Also, if you remember with OSHA guidelines, we can hear 85 dB SPL for 16 hours before we get hearing loss. That's a long time, right? So you can be in the studio all day at 85 dB SPL and you'll be fine. So 85 dB SPL is not only safe, but it's also an optimal listening level where you can hear most of the frequencies. And if you mix at 85 dB SPL, you can probably get a good mix because you're listening to everything. So something to keep in mind, right? It's full range, it's almost flat, and that's kind of what that is. So that's really the whole idea of the Fletcher-Munson curve. And where does this name come from? It's from two people, two research. Somebody with the last name Fletcher and the other person with the last name Munson. They came together, they did all these tests, and they figured out what frequencies we can hear at different volumes. So that's really what that is. All right. So Fletcher-Munson curve, and then we can move on to the inverse square law. So this is pretty interesting. NASA uses the inverse square law to measure the brightness of different stars, and depending on the brightness, they're able to measure the distance, right? But we're using it for audio purposes. And what the inverse square law states is that for every doubling of distance, you get a drop of 6 decibels, and this only happens in a free field condition, meaning like there's no, chairs, or there's no objects in the way of the sound. The sound is, free to go, right? So let's make this make sense a little bit. So this graph uses meters, it doesn't use feet, but it's distance, right? So if you have a sound source right here and you're 1 meter away, and that sound source is blasting at you at 90 dBs, right? It could be 90 dB SPL. That's what it is at 1 meter away, right? So sound is coming at you, you're 1 meter away from the sound source, it's going to be blasting at you at 90 dB SPL. If you move from 1 meter to 2 meters, that sound will drop 6 dBs. So at 2 meters, you're going to get it at 84 dB SPL. And then if you double that distance from 2 meters to 4 meters, you get a drop of additional 6 decibels, and that's going to be 78 dB SPL. So that's really kind of what it is. So for every doubling of distance, you get a drop of 6 dBs. This is kind of important because if you're out there recording sounds in the real world, things might be moving and you need to know, like, you know, how much dBs you might be losing so you can adjust your preamp, you know, at your certain way. Do I think about this when I record? Not really. You know, especially in a studio, people are usually not moving. So if I have a microphone over here, they're not really moving around too much where it's affecting my sound like drastically. But it's something that's, you know, important to know because this is really how sound works in the real world. So something to keep in mind. So that's really what the inverse square law is all about. So for every doubling of distance, you get a drop of 6 decibels. And that's really what this graph is talking about right here. Cool. So now we move on to other things. So let's talk about phase. So this is something that I actually wanted to talk about way in the beginning of the semester because it's so important. In phase, what it really is the relationship of 2 or more sound waves. Now, let's think about this for a quick second here. So I have this picture, and sometimes, depending on where you're at, you might be in this scenario where you're talking in a microphone, and you also have like a metallic metal music stand where you might have a paper on there reading your ADR script or something like that, right? So you're over here talking on the microphone. Now, when you're talking on the microphone is getting your voice directly, but it's also getting the reflection from this metal going back into the microphone itself, right? So the microphone is actually picking up 2 sources, the direct sound and the early reflection, right? This is an early reflection. We talked about that when we talked about reverb and acoustics. So the microphone is actually getting 2 sound waves. It's getting your direct sound and it's also getting the early reflection. And what's happening is that those 2 sound waves are kind of out of phase. So if you look at this graph, right, this is showing you 2 sound waves that are in phase. That means these waves are exactly the same and they're time aligned. But when you have 2 sound sources and one is there and the other one is a little bit at a time, when those 2 sound sources combine, it's going to sound a little weird. It's going to sound as if you lose some frequencies, maybe some lows, maybe some highs, maybe some mids, but it's just not going to sound right. Which is why when you're in a studio environment and if you're recording vocals, you want to try to aim to be as dead as possible. So we want to move away from that metallic stand and probably use your phone or something like that, right? Because your phone's not going to have that much of a reflection in comparison to that metallic stand. So you want to try to get things in phase as much as possible, and you want to try to eliminate any kind of reflections in your environment when you're doing, you know, good quality studio recording. Because when you have 2 sound sources out of phase with one another, it sounds a little bit weird. And I'm going to show you a video about this when we actually meet in class, so it makes a little bit more sense. Now, phase is also important in music production as well, because a lot of times in music production, we use 2 microphones to mic up 1 sound source. So take a look at this one. For you guitar players out there, this is a guitar amp, and we're using 2 microphones to mic up that guitar amp. This one's a ribbon microphone, and this is a Shure SM57. We talked about both of them, actually, when we talked about mics. When we talked about ribbon microphones, they're very natural-sounding microphones. So this is going to give it much more of a neutral sound. It might be a little bit, you know, less high-frequency intense, less bright, just more neutral. And then this one has a little bump in the upper frequency, so it's going to sound a little bit bright. So that's why we like to use 2 microphones to mic up guitars. We like 1 microphone to get the bright sound, 1 microphone to get the neutral sound, and a lot of times we combine both of them together and it creates our guitar sound, right? Now, can you imagine? Now, these 2 microphones are like dead on to the amplifier right there. They're both the same exact distance from the guitar amp. So that means they're equidistant from the guitar amp, right? So imagine if this Royer 121 microphone was like, you know, a few inches back, like maybe 6 inches back, like over here. What happens there is that if this Royer microphone is over here somewhere, like 6 inches away from the guitar, and this one's up close, this mic is going to capture the sound of the guitar first, and then the sound of the guitar is going to get captured by the roar a little bit later because it's not equidistant anymore. And so when you combine those two sound waves in Pro Tools, it's going to sound out of phase, and the guitar amplifier recording is going to sound really weird when they're both combined. So as audio engineers, we take a lot of measures to keep the microphones equidistant so you can be in phase with one another, right? So the time that the guitar amp comes to this microphone and the time that the sound comes to this microphone is exactly the same. So you'll have sound that is in phase. So this will be mic 1 and this will be the second mic, and they'll both be in phase. If that rotor was like 6 inches back and it was getting the sound from the guitar amp a little bit later, then this will be shifted to the right, and those microphones are not going to be in phase, and it's going to sound a little bit weird. You're going to lose some frequencies, and that's what sound, sounds like when you're out of phase. So something to keep in mind. Phase is something that we as audio engineers, especially when it comes to music production, especially when we're using two mics to capture one sound source, we want to make sure those microphones are exactly equidistant, and so we can get the best optimal audio recording and make sure it's in phase. So that's what that is. And we double mic a lot of stuff. Guitar amps are one of them. Sometimes we double mic bass amps. Sometimes we double mic snare drums, top and bottom. Sometimes we double mic kicks. We often use for drum recordings, we use two microphones on top. So it's getting the left and right hand side of the drum recording, of the drum kit. So there's a lot of reasons why we might double mic something. Sometimes we use every time we use two microphones to capture the sound of a room, right? So that's kind of what that is. So double miking, you want to make sure that you're in phase. You definitely don't want to be in that situation over there, using the mic in the stand. That's really not a good situation. So that's really what phase is, the relationship of two or more sound waves. And when you're in phase, you're equidistant, and when you're out of phase, you're not, or you're getting the reflection of something that's also being captured in the recording itself. So that's kind of what that whole thing is. So phase, right? We'll talk a little bit more about that in class. I'll show you some examples. Masking. Okay, so a lot of you that are doing music production is going to fall into an issue of masking. So what does this mean? Well, really, what it means is, for those music folks, when you're doing a music production project, you're going to have many tracks. So sometimes you might end up with 16 tracks. Sometimes it might be 20. Sometimes you might have like 30. Sometimes you might have 40 tracks if you're doing a music production project. The more tracks you have, the more busier music is, the more of those instruments tend to get masked. So imagine this, where you have like one kick, and if you solo that kick is going to sound nice and crispy and boomy. You're going to hear all the low frequencies, and it's going to sound amazing, right? But as soon as you start adding all your other instruments, that kick is going to disappear as soon as you add your other 40 instruments. And the reason being is because you got all these frequencies combining together, masking each other. So an example for a lot of rap folks and a lot of trap music people that use 808s, or even pop music sometimes too, is that you have an 808 and you have a kick. If you don't know what an 808 is, you can think about like Kanye West, 808s and Heartbreaks, or a lot of that rap music where you got that low end kick that's like boomy, right? So you got the 808, and then you got a regular drum kick. And then when you combine the two together, one of those things are going to disappear because they're both occupying the low frequencies. So in order to make those things separate, where you can hear the 808 and the kick separately, where they're not fighting each other, you have to EQ it, right? So you got to carve space for your instruments, so certain instruments can live in the low frequencies, certain instruments can live in the low mids, certain instruments can live in the upper mids. So everything has to have their own frequency space so the audience can hear each instrument very clearly. So that's the magic of the EQ. The EQ is going to make sure that you're not masking any of your signals, right? So you could also think about this in terms of guitars and vocals, right? So in a lot of rock songs, right, if they're not mixed correctly, when the guitar and the lead vocal is playing, your ears are going to have a hard time trying to figure out which one is the main predominant, instrument. Is it vocals or is it lead guitar? Because a lot of times the lead electric guitar is going to fight the same frequencies as where the vocal is, right? Those frequencies are predominantly like around 4, 5, 6, maybe 7 Ks, like around that area, right? So they're all the upper mids. So you have to carve space. You got to say, hey, if I want the lead to be in the background and I don't want it to take up, a lot of the space, and I don't want it to fight with the vocals, you might have to shave some of those upper frequencies down from the guitar in order to make more room for the vocals. And that's so you don't get any masking, right? So that's the whole thing about carving space. And I will also show you an example of this when we come in class. So that's really the idea of masking. When you EQ, you're not only EQing to brighten up instruments and maybe making some instruments with more low frequencies and all that kind of stuff. You're EQing to carve space so every single instrument can live in their own frequency spectrum so you don't get any masking. So that's the whole idea of masking right there. Cool. So this is definitely something that you want to think about if you're doing a music production project. You don't want to get into the trouble of masking here. And lastly, I want to talk about the Haas effect. So there's this person out there in the world. He probably passed away a long time ago, but his name was Helmut Haas, and this was back in the heyday. Yes, his name was Helmut Haas, like helmet, kind of, I don't know. So anyway, and he described what we call delays. Now, delays are different than reverb. They're not the same thing. Reverb, you could think about it as one giant, big kind of ambient space, right? They're not a delay. When you think about delay, you're thinking more about an echo. You can hear the repeated sound. So if I was in the Grand Canyon and I yelled really loud, I can hear that yell again a little bit later. That's an echo. That's more akin to a delay, right? So that's the whole idea of delays. You can hear the repeated sound. With reverb, you cannot hear the repeated sound, right? It's just one big giant kind of ambience. So delay is a little bit different. So Helmut Haas, he created something called, or he coined the term echo zone and fusion zone. Right? When the delay is long enough that you can hear the repeated sound, then that delay is called you're in the echo zone, right? So if I said hey, and then 45 milliseconds later you heard hey again, you can hear the two heys, right? That will be in the echo zone. So that's what that is. Now in audio engineering, you can make a delay so short that it can be in the fusion zone, where you're not necessarily hearing the delay. Right? And we do this all the time to create a sense of width, right? So if you have a sound source, like let's say a guitar or something like that, and it's in the middle, but you say, hey, I want to make this guitar and I want to make it sound wide, right? You don't want to put a delay on it. You want it just to make it sound like one guitar, but you want it to make it sound super wide. So what you could do is you could take that one guitar and delay it by a few milliseconds, maybe like 10 milliseconds, but you won't hear that delay. And then pan one of the guitars to the left and the other one to the right. And that's going to give you a super wide sounding guitar, right? So the idea here is remaining in the fusion zone where the delay is so short that you can't hear it, but it's creating some kind of effect. And I'll demonstrate this to you when we get into class, but these are techniques that you can use in your music production project, especially to create a sense of width, right? Because when you're mixing, you want to make sure that some instruments are in the middle, some instruments are a little bit to the side, some instruments are very to the side, the effects are kind of to the side. So you want to encompass all this stereo information. And we do these tricks to create delays so short that it creates a sense of width. By the idea of understanding how the Haas effect works and staying within the fusion zone. That's really all I wanted to go through. I hope this helps, and I hope you use some of these principles when you, or at least think about these principles when you're doing your projects or if you're doing anything audio related, because it is really important and it does come in handy when you understand how things work. It does affect your production. So hope this helps, and hope you have a nice day. Take care.